All right, good evening, everyone. My name's John Sickler, and I'm the Director of Planning and Zoning for the town of Jupiter. I'd like to thank you for joining us to celebrate Jupiter Centennial. There's plenty of activities throughout the year. If you haven't seen the list, it's available on our website. Tonight, I'm lucky to have two well-versed speakers to give you a presentation about the natural environmental history of the town. And before we get to the speakers, I would like to acknowledge some of the folks in the audience that have contributed to tonight's presentation and contribute to the environment in the town of Jupiter by the work they do. First, we have the Natural Environmental Committee for the Centennial, and we have Jamie Cunningham. I think she's out and outside getting a last-minute snack. Jocelyn O'Neill from the Loxahatchee River District, and then serving on that committee as well as our environmental task force is Beth Summers and Jill Watson. And then we also have Emily O'Mahony here from that committee or task force. And then I'd also like to acknowledge the chair of our Historic Resources Board, Debbie Murray. We also have Beth Kelso from our Planning and Zoning Commission that's here tonight, and Joe Chasen, who's the Executive Director of the Jupiter Inlet District. So apologize for anybody I might have missed, but I tried to capture some of those folks that have done so much for the community. So with that, I'd like to introduce Josh Liller. For more than a decade, Josh Liller has served as the historian and collections manager for the Loxahatchee River Historical Society, which operates the Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse and Museum. He has a bachelor's from the Florida Atlantic University, and Josh is the co-author of the revised edition of 5,000 Years on the Loxahatchee, a pictorial history of Jupiter Tequesta. He also writes the quarterly history newsletter for the Historical Society, and he frequently gives presentations about local history, which we're very thankful for. He is also the vice chair of the town's Historic Resources Board. So I'd like to thank him for his service and for being here this evening. And then after Josh, we'll be hearing from Stephanie Thoburn. Stephanie is the Assistant Director of Planning and Zoning, and she has almost 30 years of professional planning experience. She oversees long-range planning, zoning, development review, natural resources, historical preservation, and the town's workforce housing program. She has a bachelor's in landscape architecture and a master's in urban and regional planning. She's a certified planner and a member of the American Society of Landscape Architecture. She is also chair for the Vision Zero Advisory Committee for Palm Beach County Transportation Planning Agency, which seeks to have zero deaths associated with bike and pedestrian activity. So without further ado, I will pass things along to Josh.
Thank you.
Before you start, Christy Pinello is also here from our Historic Resources Board, and Lee Weber, where are you? Lee? There you are, Lee. Raise your hand. Okay. They're also from our Historic Resources Board. I wanted to make sure no one was left out.
I'm also going to acknowledge Dick Roberts, who's sitting up here in the front row, who for 35 years was the Florida Park Service biologist for the district and then the Jonathan Dickinson State Park and Loxahatchee River, and is still active in biology and in the environment, and just involved in doing the updated river management plan. Scenic Wild and River Management Plan. So the Jupiter, looking at kind of a macro level on the environment, we've got the Gulf Stream just offshore, which is vital for our weather and our climate. The Loxahatchee River is historically an outflow of the Everglades. Coming down here into what is now Wellington, down to Wellington, Loxahatchee Farms, the acreage, grassy waters, all historically up there into the Loxahatchee Slough and into the upper parts of the Loxahatchee River. The Indian River is a natural waterway. It's been modified into more of a channel. It's been straightened in places and widened, but it is a natural waterway. And then the Jupiter Inlet, which has been modified a century ago, is also still, there was a natural waterway here. The inlet opened and closed quite a bit, but it was a historic part of our area that affected the river and habitation here. Looking a little closer, we have the forks of the river. You've got the North Fork that separates Tequesta, flows all the way up out of Hobe Sound up near past Bridge Road. You've got the Southwest Fork, which today is very affected by the C-18 canal, but it's originally formed by Limestone Creek, Jones Creek, and Sims Creek coming together. You have what's today the Intercoastal Waterway down here, but historically Lake Worth Creek, and then the main portion of the waterway, that big arc up through Jonathan Dickinson State Park and then back out to Jupiter Farms as the Northwest Fork, the portion that became Wild and Scenic, and then leading out into the Loxahatchee Slough. You do also have historic references to the Jupiter River, although that is a term that gets bandied around to different waterways. I've seen it applied to Lake Worth Creek. I've seen it applied to the Loxahatchee River. One person wrote about it being the area where the Loxahatchee River and the Indian River come together to make the Jupiter River, which then flows out the inlet. And then even Jones Creek is sometimes called Jupiter Creek. So fortunately, we dropped that name entirely nowadays, so nobody's confused about it. We've had people here for 5,000 years. In fact, we just had some carbon-14 dating that confirmed that they are indeed here for 5,000 years or more over at Sawfish Bay. As you can see the photo there, the inlet looks a little different now. It was a shallow inlet prone to closing. It was south of where it is today. Parts of it would be at times more like a glorified sandbar. In the pioneer days, they repeatedly had to dig it open by hand. And actually should back up here just a moment. You've also got a variety of environments here in the Jupiter area. Over on a lot of the coastal area particularly, you have the sand pine scrub. You can see some sense of what that used to look like historically in places like Jupiter Ridge, Juneau Dunes, the eastern part of Jonathan Dickinson State Park. A lot of the area was pine flatwoods, either mesic or hydric, in other words, mostly dry or seasonally wet. There's North Jupiter Flatwoods and the western part of Jonathan Dickinson State Park that are good surviving examples of that. You had a number of depression marshes, many of them seasonal. If you go out to west of town into Pine Glades and Hungryland, you'll see examples of those. Cypress sloughs, like parts of Jones Creek, which are shallow, oftentimes linear waterways, seasonally wet, very slow flow. The Loxahatchee Slough as well, a mixture of cypress sloughs and vast grass out of the Everglades into the Loxahatchee River. And then you also have Delaware Scrub Preserve today. Walking from the parking lot to Jones Creek, you get a transition from flatwoods into a cypress slough, into scrubland, into the creek front area. So the people down here, when the Spanish arrive and the Europeans in the 1500s, are the Hobe around the Jupiter Inlet and probably part of a larger group called the Haga in what's now coastal Palm Beach County. There were no Tequesta Indians in here. They were down in Biscayne Bay. You had the Eyes people farther north along the Indian River. That's how Indian River gets its name. It's the Hobe people that essentially gives us the name of Jupiter, because Hobe in Spanish is J-O-B-E, sounds very similar to J-O-V-E. Anglicized, when they saw that, did not understand the meaning of it. The English turned Hobe into Jove, which is Jupiter or Zeus. And that gave us the inlet with its lasting name and a lighthouse and a fort and eventually a town. The landscape had limited impact from the early native peoples. They were not farmers. They did not, dig canals.
They made great use of the waterways. Their biggest impact on the landscape and the waterfronts would have been mounds and middens, such as the Du Bois Mound here. Those areas along the waterfront, evidence of their habitation and ceremonial sites, and these places would have affected how the shoreline would be altered by natural erosion. But they were predominantly hunter-gatherers. Sites like this are important to preserve and understand about what the area was like, see what life was like here, the bones and the shells that they leave behind, and the traces of their pottery and other evidence of their culture and habitation. We see that they very much valued the rivers as transportation, as for fishing, living off the bounty of the water. Their sites are predominantly along the water, particularly down by the Jupiter Inlet. You have the Jupiter Inlet complex, the Du Bois Mound, Sunny Sands, over by the lighthouse, Sawfish Bay, a number of smaller sites along the river area, and then more recent evidence of sites being found in the Riverbend Park and Loxahatchee Slough area, possibly even if they were like some of the people farther north that we know moved seasonally back and forth between coastal habitation and perhaps areas slightly farther inland, depending on game and season and so forth, weather. Europeans arrive in 1513 that we know of, with Juan Ponce de Leon's exploration stopping here at Jupiter Inlet, being affected by the Gulf Stream. Further European contact with things like the San Miguel wreck, the Jupiter wreck, and then 1696, of course, famously, Jonathan Dickinson is shipwrecked on Jupiter Island and meets the people here and writes a memoir describing his experiences of what the people here were like through his eyes and what the environment and the plants and everything were like. So a rare written account of that early contact era.
So before Josh, just wanted to point out how big this mound is. And this mound, there's a person standing on top of it. And it's not all there today, but you can see that this mound with that person standing on top of it is about 30 feet tall. So this mound took hundreds, a couple millennia of time to fill with shell. So that's one of the changes that man-made changes that occurred over time with the ancient native tribes.
And you can also see in this early map here, the first survey in the upper right, the challenges of early surveyors trying to distinguish between wetland and dry land. There's a lot of details here on the river and like Lake Worth Creek that really don't necessarily reflect reality, and probably the challenge of going, okay, where is the river, where is land, and with so much of it being tidal or seasonal wetlands and things like that, the difficulty of drawing a distinction between the two when making a map. As the Hobe and their neighbors are largely wiped out, certainly as identifiable tribes wiped out, in-come Muskogee and Miccosukee speaking people that will, through a process referred to as ethnogenesis, come together and form the Seminole tribe, the Seminole people, absorbing probably remnants of the Hobe and some of their neighbors, like those before them, making great use of the waterways, of being heavily relying on hunter-gatherers, adapting to the landscape and the climate down here with Cheekys, really showing, they and their predecessors really showing their adaptive nature to make the most of the landscape and the waterways especially. And you can see here on the right, there is a early survey chart, the earliest map we have of really what Lake Worth Creek looked like before the Intercoastal Waterway turned it into a canal, and how very different that looks than today. You can also see how much farther south the Jupiter Inlet was back then, before it was moved and straightened out. So Florida is claimed by Spain from the 1500s up until 1821, with a couple decades where the English had ruling over it. Spain relinquished it to the United States in 1821. There's the Seminole Wars from 1812 to 1858, and the attempts by the United States to remove the Seminoles from Florida along with their black allies and vassals, and send them out to Oklahoma. This leads to battles, the Loxahatchee River in January of 1838, movement of the army, movement of the riverine force of the military being dictated by the wet nature of the surrounding area in search of the Seminoles. And then later Fort Jupiter, its placement being dictated by the access to the river and wood for transportation and communication and fires. And then leading to Fort Jupiter Military Reservation, encompassing the area and shutting it off to settlement for many decades. It will kind of cause Jupiter to lag behind in some of the settlement patterns of the rest of South Florida. In the end, most of the Seminoles are sent out to Oklahoma, which creates a bit of a fracturing amongst the Seminole people. Today you have a Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, and then the legally distinct Seminole Tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee Tribe of Florida, those two Florida groups being forming today from descendants of just a few hundred Seminole people. They're able to remain in Florida and use the environment of the Everglades to make it too difficult for the U.S. military to capture them.
Just to note, why did they do that? Because United States wanted the land. They saw this as a resource. This was a very rich and vibrant upland proper area. We had lots of fish. We had lots of resources. We had oysters everywhere. So it was easy to live here. It was easy to be part of this environment. Even though there were a lot of mosquitoes and things, it was still paradise.
And you can see on the map on the left, it gives you an idea. This is there, just as from an aerial photo from, I believe, the 1940s. It really gives you an idea of just how different the landscape was pre-modern development, with the extensive marshes and ponds and creeks and sloughs and everything out there across the landscape. Very different from the landscape that we've dried out today. And then you get with the first American non-indigenous settlement here, really, with the lighthouse, its construction in 1859 and 1860, faced with difficulty because of the natural environment, from the lack of settlement in the area, the climate, the summer heat and mosquitoes making it impossible to work year-round, the difficulties with the inlet, not being able to get ships through the inlet, and they had to actually go all the way up to Fort Pierce to offload supplies and then barge it all the way down the Indian River, making it very difficult to complete the construction, but eventually succeeded in 1860. So the arrival of, you get tourists coming down here after the Civil War, drawn by the fact that it's still the frontier, that it's still viewed as a wilderness without much in the way of settlement. Hundreds of people from Miami to Titusville back then. Quite a few extra zeros on that population number today. But being drawn to the hunting and the fishing and just exploring this very unique area with unique climate and environment compared to most of the rest of the country. Warm climate also attracted early pioneers for health reasons, that they had tuberculosis or lung issues or whatnot, that they were advised by doctors to seek out a warmer climate and avoid seasonal cold. Homestead grants would, after the legal situation with the Fort Jupiter Military Reservation was wound up around the turn of the century, you get homestead grants in the area where the government gives land to people in exchange for settlement to speed up the process of bringing people into our area, just like it did out in the West, to settle the area, to get people on the tax rolls, to bring civilization to the area. You get the Jupiter Inlet Life Saving Station from 1885 to 1889 to help people, the ships, the boats trying to get through the very difficult Jupiter Inlet. Again, an environmental and natural factor here. And 1888, a Weather Bureau and Signal Station next to the lighthouse. This is the southernmost weather station on the east coast of the United States. So transmitting that weather information back to Washington in the early days of weather forecasting and trying to understand and predict weather, something we're still challenged with today, but also to alert ships to the storms and the hurricanes, to alert farmers to potential freezes, to be able to protect them and protect their crops.
So one of the things if you look at the bottom right hand is you'll see that old picture from the pioneers. They also had, because of the inlet wasn't formalized yet. We had more fresh water in our rivers, which led to more cypress, and you can see that in this picture. We had less mangroves and we had more cypress. And because it was beginning of the Industrial Revolution, cypress was one of the things that people logged. And, I've read things about large swaths of cypress being logged along the riverfront. Josh, I don't know if you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, there was logging sporadically throughout the area from pioneer settlement going onward, both pine and cypress logging from the Damon family and the Hunt sawmill up near where the state park is today, continuing up through right before World War II with some extensive cypress logging along the river on land that was owned by one of the Jupiter Island residents. And if not for Camp Murphy in World War II interceding, probably would have logged a lot more of the cypress than he did. And then, some photos from the early days here with the school there by Sawfish Bay and the oak that's still standing today, the early train station and the early stores in Sawfish Bay, the river being how the settlers got their crops down to the railroad station to ship north to markets, the railroad opening up people coming down here for settlement, being more efficient than steamboats. And then if you look very carefully, it's a little tricky to see here in this aerial from the 20s. There's a little spot out here where they've built a causeway out into the river, and they're actually harvesting oyster bars out of the river to be used as road fill elsewhere in Palm Beach County.
And that was, just to follow up on that, that was because they had already gone through the natural resources of digging through the mounds and selling that off. So one of the mounds that you saw earlier with Du Bois, that was also, parts of it were sold off. And then there was also one at Sawfish Bay where the big oak tree is. That mound was known to be significant, over 15, 20 feet tall. And because the railroad was there, it was easily transported onto the railroad to be used in Dade County. And this used to be Dade County. So, they used that mound material as a natural resources. And then when they literally didn't dig out from under them, they started going into the river for more natural resources.
And unfortunately, this is the earliest aerial that we have of the Jupiter area. Unfortunately, the inlet is just out of frame in the original photo, but it would show what was then the brand new inlet. The Jupiter Inlet District, created in 1921 as a taxing district because the pioneers here just got sick and tired of digging the inlet open by hand every couple of years. And so they formed a taxing district to be able to raise funds to build the straight inlet that we understand today with its jetties. Still required constant dredging and improvements over the years, but moved the inlet 1,200 feet to the north from where it used to be, and gave us more or less the inlet that we know today. So this was a transportation hub, as it had been with the Native Americans, and even more so with steamboats and the railroads being able to ship things from here and bring people here. The Celestial Railroad being an example of that, before we had the Intercoastal Waterway connecting Jupiter to Lake Worth through a narrow gauge railway, and then the Flagler's FEC Railway coming through and really connecting us even much larger from Miami, West Palm Beach to Jupiter and all the way up to Jacksonville and to the rest of the country. Enabled a lot of the agricultural industry, and the settlers and their accounts were quite happy to have this railroad come through instead of no longer be feeling this isolation in the wilderness. And then in the 1880s and 1890s, the efforts to dig what was then the Florida East Coast Canal, a private venture intended to be funded by tolls, by boats using the canal portions of the waterway, and would eventually in 1930s being taken over by the federal government as the intercoastal waterway that we enjoy today. And it was the 1930s where they began to instead of not just dig a deeper channel there, but straightening it out and widening it and start cutting off some of the oxbows. And it was this work, you can kind of see some of it here in the lower right, removing some of these bends that cause the water to drain faster, better for navigation, not as good for water quality. But they first cut through from Jupiter. Lake Worth Creek did not historically go to Lake Worth. It went down next to it, and then where Parker Bridge is on US 1, that was just a big sand ridge separating the lake from the wetlands where Palm Beach Gardens is today. And after a lot of years of difficulty, they cut through that to make a canal and have struggled for many decades afterwards to keep it from this ridge from sliding back in and filling it in again. But from the late 1890s onward, we've got that intercoastal waterway to connect us and allow everything from pleasure yachts to larger shipping to come through from the north to Lake Worth, Palm Beach Island, and Miami. And again, you can see here a larger aerial from the 1940s of just how wet the landscape was, especially during the summer, and how different that is today. But you also get a good view here of, on the eastern part, some of that drier, sandy area, which was really appealing to some of the early settlers for pineapple growing, because it's ideal land for that. It was here in Jupiter, before the town and even after the town incorporated, it was predominantly a small farming community. The Pennock Plantation being a huge part of that with their fernery, plant nursery, and dairy. There was even a sandbar at the time across the mouth of the southwest fork of the river, which at low tide, the cattle that they thought they could pen up on Pennock Point would sometimes wander back across on the sandbar and wander back into the plantation. They had to look for more enclosed areas farther south. Besides the pineapple industry, which started to die out, the fern industry started by the Pennocks continued to grow, and for decades there was a major industry here in our area as the background from floral arrangements shipped up for shipping up. It was shipped up north on the railroad, and the Pennocks were the largest, but other families like the Wilkinsons, Turner Quay, dozens of other families with a couple acres and ferns as well. In addition to that, there was some citrus farming and the large-scale crop for a lot of farmers, all the way from Jupiter Farms into what we now know as the town of Jupiter, the Limestone Creek area. What was referred to at the time as truck farming, which is small-scale vegetable farms, and then packing it up on the railroad to ship north to markets on consignment, often living crop to crop.
So just adding on to that, one of the things is if you look at all of the wetlands in here, keep this in mind as the 50s approach, because that's the time when we start thinking that we can control everything after the war. So remember this aerial. So.
And it's during this time period in the early 1900s where you have things like the Loxahatchee Farms and Groves development west of West Palm Beach that is kind of built astride the Loxahatchee Slough and is the first step in cutting off a lot of that natural sheet flow out of the Everglades and into our river. And then in the 1920s, you have Jupiter Farms and Groves, which is today Jupiter Farms, originally an agricultural community, put in the canals in the 1920s to help drain that land. And that's the beginning of canals affecting the river, affecting the water quality, reducing the holding of the water into marshes and wetlands, and then just slowly drain over time, and now trying to funnel it out quicker.
But if you live in the farms, and my parents do, the soil out there is really rich, and it's because it was part of the wetlands, the headwaters, and so once it got drained, we had that rich soil for tomatoes and farming and other vegetables.
And if you look really closely at that map, you can kind of see that this area was also taken during a period when the Jupiter Inlet had shut during World War II. It had to be dredged back open, and there were definitely concerns with the people at the time that the river being kind of stagnant without that water flow was Not good for the river, not good for the residents. Is a view of the Sawfish Bay area, which Stephanie is going to talk in more depth about efforts with modern times to do environmental work there, but it was altered over the years for marina access, for fishermen, commercial fishing fleet there, as well as the residences nearby. And on the right, you can also see, not only highlighting where the Sawfish Bay area is relative to the rest of the river, in the foreground, you can see some areas where the old estuary and parts of the river have been filled in at Du Bois Park to create that Coconut Point Peninsula and the part of the parking lot today. If you had historically gone to the Du Bois house in the early 1900s, before World War II, those stairs that come down in front of the house would have taken you all the way down to the waterfront. Nowadays, it takes you right down to dry land. World War II, you have two major bases here in the Jupiter area. The Naval Radio Station Jupiter on the lighthouse property, searching for the U-boats out there in the Atlantic. But then the even more impactful is Camp Murphy in what's now Jonathan Dickinson State Park. The peak of the camp had 6,500 people there at one time. And so that's the population of the whole Jupiter area was not even 1,000 people. So you have a very sudden influx of, among other things, wastewater going from the camp into the North Fork of the river, which they're trying to treat with a wastewater facility before it's released, but in the 1940s, I'm sure the wastewater treatment was not as effective at the time. And also the river, as I mentioned, is closed, the inlet is closed at this time, so this is contributing to pollution issues in the river. So after World War II, we go through a series of major change periods after kind of a long period of small agriculture community where not a lot has changed. The town incorporates in 1925, but it doesn't radically alter the area as it might have elsewhere. So you have initially a brief lull after the war, and then development picks up in the 1950s, which will lead to kind of a backlash against this development, that we need to regulate this, that we need to be conscious of the environment. And meanwhile, I-95, as part of a national interstate highway network, is kind of looming over everything, and the debate about where that will go, that debate that will drag on for literally 2 decades, and then the completion of it affecting the development of the area and an influx of population. So 1953 here, you can see in the lower left, the inlet starting to look more like we recognize today, although it's got that little hockey stick on the south side that was intended as a sand trap, and the jetties have been altered. And that constant struggle to make the inlet as efficient as possible, and that struggle between safe for navigation, efficient water flow, but also then you have the beach erosion around it. The more effective your jetties are for keeping your inlet open, the more troublesome they are in your coastal drift of sand, not just here at Jupiter, but anywhere in the world. The 1950s is a massive change for Jupiter with the beginning of real development in the area, but it's also considered to be a watershed moment worldwide. It's referred to as the beginning of the Anthropocene epoch. The National Geographic definition of that being the period in which Earth's history where human activity has started to have a significant impact on climate and ecosystems. One way that happens is right after World War II, there's a series of bad hurricanes in the late 1940s in South Florida. There's a lot of flooding that is very devastating, and this prompts the creation of the Central and South Florida Flood Control District. So what the vision is, okay, drain the land. Not concerned about environment at the time, just don't have floods, make it more suitable for development.
And so if you look at the aerial, you can start seeing those little straight black lines that have been introduced into the landscape that bisect these areas that were once floodplains. So if you think about where Jupiter Creek or Jones Creek is today, or Sims Creek, and then the watershed that led to those things, that those have all been modified with straight black lines that are ditches and canals. And then those changed over time when the development occurred.
And you get especially here with Jones Creek. You can see here how it past Indiantown Road toward the south middle part of this photo. It splits off into like a whole handful of little fingers of sloughs and streams. And now it's a big L-shaped canal today. So the flood control district leads to the construction of the C-18 canal to drain the Loxahatchee Slough and Hungerland Slough, probably the single biggest change to the Loxahatchee River. What was once a very clear river with white sandy bottom, the water quality starts to go down. There starts to be more muck and things on the bottom. The fish populations start to change. As Stephanie mentioned, Jones Creek, the canal also coming up from what's now the heights of Jupiter, ditches out in the Cypress Creek area for farmers and ranchers out there, the Hobe Groves Canal leading out of Hobe Sound and into the Loxahatchee River up by the state park, smaller ditches and canals out in Loxahatchee Slough for improving that for farming and ranching. There are upsides, Camp Murphy being preserved as Jonathan Dickinson State Park would certainly be a big boon for the river and for preserving part of the natural environment here. Clicker doesn't like me.
I don't know what's happening.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, okay. Did you get it or did I?
I don't know.
Okay.
The wonders of technology. The 1950s here see from between 1954 to the end of the 1950s, you have the big Jupiter Inlet Colony is developed, Tequesta is developed. So that's right outside the town, but so, it's right across the river. It's going to have an impact on Jupiter as well as especially the river. US 1 is straightened out, brought off of the beach onto the new 4-lane alignment. What was then the new bridge being built across the river, that is the one they're replacing right now. The turnpike comes through. Beeline Highway is built. Indiantown Road out in the farms is moved out to a nice straight line, which is great for travel and transportation, but now you're interrupting sheet flows of water across long distances through this. And you're bringing more people to the area by increased accessibility through the turnpike in US 1. And then, of course, Pratt Whitney being one of the biggest changes out there, eager to preserve the area around them, like Corbett, to make sure that people didn't build there because then they would complain about the jet engine noise. But also bringing in more settlement to Jupiter, people wanting to move here because there is now a great place to work out there. In the 1960s, so this is 1964, we just saw earlier the 1953. You're starting to see some of the changes on this aerial with more straight lines of canals, more development moving in. You also have, at this point, there's a practice called dredge and fill. You dredge out the river so it's better for boats, and then you dump it on tidal areas or mangrove shorelines to make more waterfront property and make the river narrower. It's called Browardization. The dirty word here in Jupiter. And you protect them with bulkheads and seawalls instead of having natural cypress or mangroves to protect the shoreline. So now your water is not getting filtered as much by the natural environment. You don't have the oysters, you don't have the roots for the things to grow around. The water is flushing out and draining out faster. So there was in the 1960s, as part of a larger environmental movement, there is a pushback against that in the area. People like Bill Lund pushing back on it with support from groups like the Audubon, from the group that probably few people today remember, the Isaac Walton League, really pushing back and trying to get this practice stopped to protect our river, which they largely succeed in doing here in Jupiter. Although you would not get the Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act was not passed in Florida until 1996. You also have a change in the mindset at the state level of moving from the flood control districts to now their water control districts. You're not simply trying to drain the land, you're trying to manage water as a resource. You have challenges in the 1970s here as the changes to the river with the inlet being open on a regular basis, the runoff from the C-18 canal, the narrowing of the river in the 1920s for Old Dixie Highway and an expanded FEC Railroad Bridge, creating a lot of sandbars and oyster beds right around the bridge area. And then with the changes in the river, the oysters died. And so there's a lot of the very controversial issue in the 1970s that eventually does get these oyster bars and sandbars dredged. The big pushback is, well, the tidal flushing will be better for the river. And then the biologists pointed out that, this is going to cause saltwater intrusion farther up the river, and the cypresses that which used to grow down regularly down to and sometimes below the state park boundary are now retreating farther upstream as the salt water is going farther upriver on a regular basis, and the mangroves, which prefer the salt water and the cypress don't like it, are pushing them back. And it's still a challenge today with the water management and the wild and scenic river management to get the proper flows and levels in the river to maintain a healthy river and maintain and hopefully push back the cypress back downriver even a little bit if possible. You also get, in the 1970s, a Loxahatchee Lament, which is a fantastic resource on reminiscences of the area and what the area and what the river was like in pioneer days. It's also an interesting intersection of history and advocacy, as the driving impetus behind it is Ives Carey being an advocate concerned about the river, but also specifically wanting to get those pesky oyster bars removed. So an interesting intersection there of environment and history and politics. You have also the efforts of people like Bobby Culpepper to recognize that the environment is an important issue that we need to be conscious about where we route I-95, that we need to be preserving the river. We get the first state park biologists in 1970. You also start to see a bit of a shift in the development from the old drain, everything with a canal, to maybe we should have some retention ponds and just store that water on the property instead of just getting rid of it as quickly as possible. And efforts like the Riverkeeper system to monitor the river, help the biologists have the data to understand what was going on in the river, our river and other rivers here in Florida, what's going on, where are the problems, what can we do possibly to improve this river health. You also have some success in the 1970s with a beach bond that will preserve, and the efforts of Bobby Culpepper on getting some of the public beaches that are to preserve and hold into public. That's why we have so many of them up here in North County from Jupiter going south. There was political efforts to save them from development so they don't have condominiums built on it and don't block off access to the public, which is, I grew up in Martin County. I was just surprised to see how rare it was to have lots of public beach access on the coast like that. You also have the efforts by the county, which included Bobby, to preserve and add infrastructure to parks like Jupiter Beach Park, buying Du Bois Park from the Du Bois family. Carlin Park, the Palm Beach County got that in the 50s from the federal government, but adding facilities and things to it to allow it to serve a large number of people and provide a lot of great beach access up here. And then in the 1980s, this campaign that's been going on in since the 60s about preserving the river, how do we protect it? Town population at this point in the town of Jupiter is still under 10,000 people, although it's probably over 20,000 in the whole Jupiter Tequesta Farms area and is growing. In the 1980s, that I-95 debate is resolved to route it along the east side of the turnpike to complete that 2-decade-old missing link, which is going to expand the property values in West Jupiter with some negative impacts on the people already living out there in the Limestone Creek community, but also just bringing more and more people here to Jupiter as it becomes more accessible and more desirable and is areas farther south get overdeveloped. But the big success of the 1980s is that preservation of the Northwest Fork of the river to get it designated as Florida's first national wild and scenic river with the purchase of the river corridor and with support of people, not only people like Bill Lund that have been fighting for the 60s, but people like just recently passed Governor Bob Graham was a big advocate for that in the 1980s. And as I've said, that's a major milestone in getting that wild and scenic river designation, but the management challenges continue through to today. I'm going to turn it mostly over to Stephanie from this point.
And feel free to jump in, Josh. So Josh gave us the story of how we got here. I just wanted to show you where we are today. And this is, Jupiter compared to what is typical development in South Florida. And these two aerials, it's around the Boca area to the bottom, are the same scale. They're about 8 miles from the Atlantic beach to the inland. So you can see the differences in Jupiter and the differences that are to the south of us. We're both along the Everglades. We both have the intercoastal, but we treated things differently here. And so how we compare and how we got here, so that's why we wanted to tell you that story, is again today. And the differences for Jupiter is what makes us unique and special. And I like to say that the story comes from, is it a series of events that occurred because people who lived here and loved their home and wanted to preserve it, whether you were the indigenous populations, the Hobe, or even the Seminoles that came later, the Miccosukees, or the pioneers, or during the time of the Civil War. People came here for a reason, because the same reason why we're here, the same reason why we love Jupiter and why you're sitting here and wanting to learn more about it. But I actually think that there's a couple of things happening here. One is that it could be a series of events, or two, is it the land and the energy of the land and the water, and that culmination of the water, the Indian River Lagoon, the Loxahatchee, the Fork, the Limestone Creek, all of those things coming together, the inlet, all of those things are special. Are they magic? Is it special? And then it starts to tell you a story about what is here and why people are so passionate about being here. I want you to think about that, because that's some of why the work we do comes out, and you'll see that as I talk further. So the 1980s, we talked a little bit about that, but we started to preserve more. The county came here and said, "Hey, we've got bonds. Let's go buy some land in Jupiter." We actually had some. So they purchased lands along the Jupiter Ridge Natural Area and what's today Karen Marcus Preserve, and significant scrub habitat. But we also approved large swaths of land, over 1,000 dwelling units on the high and dry land that's perfect for development, right? It's always been high and dry, the bluffs. And the bluffs is called the bluffs because there was a ridge there. There's a ridge and a bluff, and it was high and dry, and it was perfect for developing. And so, when that happened, people started to take notice. More people started coming. 1986, you can see here, the I-95 was under construction. And you can see with all these little aerials how things really change. Now remember that 1940s aerial with all the little black dots of the wetlands, and then we had the little black lines of straightening things out. So now you can start to see, where's my house? Where do I live? And the areas that were always high and dry were always the best places to develop. And so you can see that. So along the north end, where there's pine flatwoods, where there's scrub, those are the perfect places to develop. and look at. So those things changed over time. And then in 1989, 1987, 1989, I tend to disagree, but Josh, Josh said it's 87, but I have something that said 89. But in 1989, we were talking, and that's when the interstate, I-95, opened. So if you remember, if you were here and you lived here long enough or you came through here, before that, you'd have to get off at Fort Pierce and get on US 1. And then if you saw the Yum Yum tree, you thought you were stopping for a restaurant and realized it was a furniture store, and then kept going to West Palm because that was the way you came down here. But I-95 came, and it changed our world, and it really opened the door to explosive growth. Thankfully, at that time, we had already had a comprehensive plan, which is the blueprint of development. But because the state mandated in 1985 a Growth Management Act, the town was able to put in their comprehensive plan requirements that were novel at the time, like 25%, preserving 25% of your property that has environmental habitat must be preserved and maintained. And so when we had our explosive growth and Dade County and Broward County were already built, we were building with a different set of rules that said, thou shalt preserve 25%. And so we started with that. We were poised for that growth. We were ready to go. And then you started to see things in 1990s where we had MacArthur Foundation. John D. MacArthur had all this land in Jupiter and Palm Beach County and the whole area, and they were just ready to sell. They were ready to get rid of it all. And we froze and we're like, wait a minute, do we want more traditional, conventional suburban development, or do we want to create a place, and do we want to interject, and part of that, a greenway? So these are pictures, if you've been around Abacoa, you've seen them. But this is the plan that was adopted in 1995. And the plan shows a greenway. And so in 1995, the town adopted the mixed-use zoning district that provided for this greenway. And that's when, soon thereafter, that's when myself and John Sickler, the director, came. And I was straight out of college. And I looked at this plan and I said, this is great, the Greenway is really great. But then I asked my big boss, Sam Shannon at the time, I'm like, but where does it go? And so we talked to the mayor at the time, Karen Galanka, and we went to her and she was like, yeah, where does it go? What should we should do a bond. And so it was the first time we really got to thinking about buying land to weave together development and green space and open space, and then how to program those things. So that the stormwater isn't just a rectangle that you mow that holds water every once in a while. That stormwater looks like the bottom left-hand corner, where it can provide some habitat, pollinators, and it functions as some habitat. It's not all contiguous. But then when you look at what was done in 2004, and then again in 2004, the residents voted for an open space bond to preserve land in the town, and we ended up buying a fair amount, and then we did it again in 2019. So, when they say, well, if you don't like the development going on, let's buy some of that. And part of that was because we were also concerned over the traffic. So with that plan and the idea starting from Abacoa, we were able to then connect and weave and create necklaces, green necklaces here, blue necklaces with the waterways, and then also connect. So I don't think the thing's working, but you see that little, to the top, there's a straight green line going over. Well, that's the connection to Riverbend, Jonathan Dickinson, and all that. But there's a critter crossing that goes under the road, and it connects Jupiter Flatwoods to a 600-foot wide greenway that then connects to Lands and Dupuy and gets you to the state greenway system. So guess what? We have things like bobcats still, and we still have a little, I think last year we had, or is it the year before, we had a black bear come through Center Street, and people wonder, well, how'd that get there? Well, through our greenway and through our blueways. You know, it was a very low tide, and that bear came in along the Loxahatchee and walked along the creek and then walked up. Probably came from Jonathan's, you know, looking for food. So with these efforts from the town in the 2004 and 2019, and then during that time, we also looked at Delona.
Yeah, the 2008, we get the outstanding natural area around the Lighthouse Reservation is preserved through a congressional act, which we've seen as executive orders aren't enough. You need a congressional act. The lighthouse, for its history, for the archaeology, but also for the environment, for the passive recreation there. You know, the majority of it is a natural area. It's preserving that shoreline area. And you know, a great coalition example there of our historical society having built a positive relationship with the Coast Guard who had the land, that they were happy to see it be put to good preservation. That the Bureau of Land Management had seen that the Historical Society was a good partner with a government entity, that they could work with us, and the idea being put forth by a member of the Bureau of Land Management at the time. And then, you know, a great coalition from the local community, from the local governments at the municipal and county level, and then the legislators in Congress and the Senate getting on board to get bipartisan legislation passed in 2008. So just a really great success story for history and the environment there on that property.
So the Blueways Greenways map is the mapping of all public and private lands. So during development, remember the 25% set aside? Well, those are required to be maintained in perpetuity through easements. So those easements have also been mapped on this map. The animals don't know the difference. They still go there. So you can see here the mapping of all of those places. Now, what isn't on that map is what I like to call, and in the business, it's called green public infrastructure. And this is where we've moved to today, and that's taking those lands in the public right-of-ways, that are stormwater or in the roads, and taking them and planting them and making them beautiful, but also making them function for habitat. So the upper picture there is, if you remember, the turnpike, when you came off, if you were here really long ago, it was the Welcome Center and you could get your orange juice. Well, that little right-of-way was given to the town, and then we put in, and Emily O'Mahony, who's out in the audience here, designed this gateway feature to put in native and xeric plant material. There's no irrigation, and it's been out there for 2 years now. No irrigation, and we created rain gardens, put in solar, and then in the back there, the contractor thought I was a little crazy because it wasn't on the plans, but I said, can you just dig it out and use that dirt for the sign and just leave it there, the depression. And we created a little wetland in the back. And there's another wetland on Jupiter Country Club. So not soon after we weren't even done, there was a 7-foot gator that was going through that little depression. And he didn't know the difference. He was thinking everything, this is all for him anyway. So, you know, these are the things that we try to think about when we're looking at public infrastructure, streetscapes, and our open space program. So our open space, the land, the bond money has bought over 150 acres in the town, which the town manages. We do restoration, remove the exotics, and then we would provide public access on it. And then we connect that with the green public infrastructure as well. So we were going along and making things beautiful, making things function, and then we had a bunch of green-blue algae. Remember that? That really took a number on our wildlife. We saw our fish populations go down, you know, and it became a real detriment. It was pretty sad. People were, you know, I mean, if you were here during that time, your eyes burned and things like that. And we were constantly looking at how we could do better and what can we do so you can see it's called cyanobacteria. It happens naturally, but the fact that it's happening in great numbers is what's concerning. And what can we do about that? So, you know, the town council said, let's do something with it, and let's do a new strategic priority that preserves and restores seagrasses. So what can we do to do that? We started out with looking at Sawfish Bay Park. And so when we first started looking at because we own that land, and we own Karen J. Galanka Island, and then Sawfish Island is owned by the Florida Inland Navigation District, but it was recently updated to put in wetlands, as well as we also own Pyatt Place. So we looked at historically, what did this area look like? How do we go about changing these things? What do we need to do, since all these anthropogenic changes, these man-made changes that occurred over time? And it's like, okay, well, all these man-made changes occurred. What man-made changes do we need to take in order to address that and combat it, so that we can, you know, we've learned so much. We're not just trying to drain and move water. We're trying to hold it. We're trying to water plants with it. We're trying to feed wildlife with it. We're trying to create and recreate what we didn't know any better. You know, we did things that we didn't know, and we thought it would go on forever. So looking and understanding those things, I went back and said, okay, Sawfish Bay, why was it called Sawfish Bay? Because there were sawfish there. And we actually have, historically, from the archaeologists, they found sawfish bone at Sawfish Bay Park. So that whole area, sawfish, if you know, the nursery needs seagrass. Well, that whole area was a bay. And so we were like, well, what's going on and what can we do? Let's look at marine restoration, and let's go look at how we can add living shorelines and add oysters and put back the oysters that were taken away over the course of 100 years. Not going to be easy, but we need to work with our partners to make sure they're not a navigation hazard. So if we put them in the right place and we put them where people want them and where they can see them, then we can clean and filter the water. We didn't do this alone. We actually said it took a little bit extra time, but we got with Jupiter Environmental Research Field Studies Academy, JERFSA, at the high school here, and we got them to help put in reef balls and be part of that solution and educate, because we wanted to create opportunities for the students to learn and be good stewards overall. This is a future dream. It's not funded. What I showed you was funded. There's 3 phases in Sawfish Bay to do living shorelines. But the bigger picture is to do marine restoration in the entire bay, and creating a true aquatic preserve by creating additional opportunities for oysters, for seagrass, for fishing, for recreation, for kayaking, for all of those things that we moved here for. So, and then here's a picture of today. You can see a sea turtle. Now, if you recall, if you've ever been to Sawfish Bay, it has, for the majority of it, a vinyl seawall, which provided very little habitat. And so we put these reef balls in at installation, and they have a pH level that's close to seawater. And and the oysters love them. You put it in the water, and those little tiny fries that Ashley back there always talks about, they're the little tiny baby fish. They come straight to it like a magnet. And during the mullet season, they hang out over here because the big guys can't get them. So it's fun because you're standing on the side and you see all this life, and you're like, wow, there's stuff going on. And this little guy down here, the spotted eagle ray, he was out there hanging out for like 40 minutes while we were giving a tour. So those are some of the things that we've been excited to help bring back.
I just wanted to also add that we've seen very similar, very positive results from the living shoreline that was put in on the south side of the outstanding natural area with the help of Jupiter Inlet District a couple of years ago, and seeing the same sort of thing where the shellfish are moving in, the mangroves are coming in. We've seen more fish there off of that shoreline than we probably had ever seen before. So it's just amazing to see the change for the better for the river.
And I heard some really big bull sharks too. So.
At least once, yeah.
but keeping that in mind, we also have the Jupiter River Walk, and this is the original concept is to provide public access along our natural resources. But as we move forward through today, we're looking at it as a means to promote more environmental awareness, environmental restoration. Yes, we want to complete the Riverwalk and bring it all the way up to the inlet, but in doing so, that structure will provide a host for additional marine restoration, living shorelines, opportunities for green infrastructure such as rain gardens, living seawalls. So we're really excited to be able to look at that for the future. And the council just adopted, the Community Redevelopment Agency just adopted a new community redevelopment plan that supports the spending of those local tax monies for the purposes of environmental restoration, as well as historic purchase of property and completion of the Riverwalk. And then this is a future project that we're working on right now. And if you ever remember what kids around here called the dungeon, Pyatt Place was that piece of property with the parking structure that was under the ground, and it had graffiti all over it. It's gone now because the Jupiter Fire Rescue is going to be located on that property. But with the approval of the fire station will be a new park that will provide a Riverwalk loop, preserve the shoreline, and preserve existing seagrasses. In this little cove here, we have a significant amount of seagrasses, a kayak launch that's ADA accessible, and then more living shorelines. So we're definitely excited about the projects and work we can do. And in doing so, in understanding what we learned from the history of the place, is how we were able to then understand what we need to do for the future. So this is us today, and I'm happy that we got to share our story with you. Whether or not you believe that Jupiter looks the way it does because of the people and events that have occurred over the years with I-95, the fight over I-95, or the tolls on the Intracoastal Waterway, or whether you or not you believe that this place is uniquely Jupiter and is special, and there's something here that makes people want to preserve, is up to you. I hope that because you're here, you believe that too. And I just hope that everyone here will help tell this story to all their friends about stewardship so that we can continue with this legacy. Okay, well, I know we're a little late, but I didn't know if anybody had any questions. So, Mr. Roberts.
I just came from the workshop on the Southward Water Management for salinity and problems and saltwater intrusion and global warming. So we we confronted that and we're talking about that. And I guess everybody is trying to say now we need to get our arms around it. And part of the plan that Josh talks about the river is we are trying to figure out what's going to happen. And a lot of these towns like you guys, south of here, are trying to work this out. What's your future on global warming? What's going to happen in this community? Have you started thinking about what's going to happen?
Well, global warming, I mean, sea level rise, we are doing a vulnerability assessment. So we're in the process of that, which tells us where everything is flooding. And then with that, we're hoping to do more to, stabilize our shorelines and plant more trees, have less pavement, all those good things, so.
The guy that I know is mayor of Coral Gables, I grew up down there. And he said he ran on just being a mayor, and now he says probably 50% of his time is devoted now to what's happening on sea level rise and these little communities that have little bridges that all of a sudden they can't get to their homes and king water tides and things like that. So yeah, it's starting to affect your community and everybody south of here. Yes.
Thank you for being on the Loxahatchee River Preservation Initiative.
Yeah. And actually the council is probably is doing the plan.
Yes, thank you so much. Is there anybody else who, oh, yes.
I didn't know if anyone knew where Jones Creek got its name from.
You know, that's a great question.
As far as we know, it was the guy who did the survey for the government for the first time in 1855-ish that he named the creek after himself.
I didn't know if it was named after Sam Jones is why I was asking.
That would be a good guess, yeah, but no, and as far as I know, it's not.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah, that big oak tree in Sawfish Bay.
Big giant oak tree that's been there.
Cabot Oak.
Okay. Has anyone, any reports of anyone being hung from that tree back in the day?
No, thankfully not that we know of. It's a very old oak tree. It was big, as you saw in the photo there that photo's from the early 1900s, maybe 1908, if I recall correctly. And so it was already very substantial at that point. But yes, thankfully nobody that we know of lynched there. It was just a nice backdrop for the early business district in the school.
And Fred Cabot was buried under it.
Yeah. He was not lynched. He had a mishap with the train.
Yes. 2 years after he removed the shell mound, he got hit by a train. Is it an accident? I don't think so.
Trail in Jupiter.
The Ocean to Lake Trail here passes through the Riverbend Park corridor and then up the west side of the South Florida Water Management District property along the Loxahatchee River, connecting Riverbend Park up to Western Jonathan Dickinson State Park.
We have a missing link because of the turnpike is so low when it was built. It's just like 3 feet above grade. So, you have to go through Jonathan Dickinson, but hopefully one day we can get that connected so that we can come through town and then go down the C-18.
You can get under the turnpike in 95 on it as long as the river's not too high. August, not a good idea. This time of year, probably will be okay.
What? Yes, Christy.
Wondering, I don't know if you know this, but question. So during the Revolutionary War, 1775. So what was Florida's stance on that? So if it was settled, there were Spanish forts and things there, and Spain and England weren't really getting along. Was Florida kind of for the Revolutionary War, the colonists, or?
So the British period in Florida is 1763 to 1783. They got it after the Spanish had lost Havana to the British, and they really wanted Havana, Cuba back, so they traded Florida for Havana. And then 20 years later, the Spanish joined the American Revolution on behalf of the Patriots, and the Spanish got Florida back as a result of their contribution to the war effort. Because just about all of the Spanish residents in Florida in 1763 had left with the Spanish government and gone mostly down to Cuba, or some back to Spain. So the vast majority of people in British Florida during the American Revolution were recent transplants from Britain or British colonies, and so it was generally loyalist. There was a small effort to try to seize St. Augustine early in the war that didn't really amount to much.
I always learn something with Josh here. I think that's all we have for tonight, and I wanted to thank everyone for being here, and we're happy to share this knowledge with you.
Thank you all for coming.